It's the burning question on the minds of air travellers everywhere. How much will volatile oil prices affect the cost of my plane ticket?
If the instability spreads to Saudi Arabia, which is such a crucial producer, then all bets are off.
Join me to meet the skier who filmed himself falling off a cliff and find out why wedding fever is sweeping the web.
And I'll be finding out why elephant safaris like this one play a very important role in preserving the wildlife of Nepal.
Hello and welcome to Fast Track. I'm Rajan Datta. Now, just when travellers and the airline industry alike thought we were over the worst of the recession, along comes uncertainty and unrest in the Middle East to throw us all off course again. But there do seem to be very different takes on what might happen to oil prices. On the one hand, there are the optimists who say, don't worry, it's just a little bit of turbulence, it'll all sort itself out in the end. And then there are the Cassandras, the pessimists, who believe that this is just the beginning, that oil prices will rocket and that the price of our next business trip or holiday will hit the roof. So who's right?
Come gather round, people, wherever you roam.
This is, of course, what all the fuss is about. As the unrest in Libya looks set to be a long, drawn-out affair, its relatively small contribution to global oil production, 2%, is still substantial enough to get markets fluttering and airlines panicking. What's more, Libya supplies 10% of Europe's aviation fuel needs.
Oh, the times they are a-changing.
The airline body IATA has issued a gloomy revised warning about industry profits for this year. It's estimated they will tumble from $16 billion in 2010 to just over $8 this year. And that's because oil prices have soared way above the original $84 a barrel originally factored into the predictions, to $120 last week and rising.
Airlines are facing a very sharp rise in fuel costs, and it's a very fuel-intensive business. Almost 30% of costs are made up by fuel, and so margins are being squeezed, which is why we expect actually to see net profits virtually halve this year from where they were in 2010.
Of course, it's arguably in IATA's interest to play up the negatives here, and inevitably they use this opportunity to attack air passenger duties by government. But there's no doubt these trends are particularly punishing for companies that run on very low profit margins, like the budget airlines.
What do you do about that? Well, you've got two major options, right? One is you try to cut costs even further, which these days are very difficult because most airlines have undergone 5 to 10 years of stringent cost cutting already. Secondly, your structural costs and your overall overhead costs, etc., have risen so much, and taxation has risen so much, that there's not a whole lot of leeway. So what other option do you have? The only other option really is to add that on to the cost of the ticket, yes.
Scheduled airlines in particular do insure against sudden rises in oil prices by hedging, buying up amounts of oil in advance at relatively stable prices. But hedging really only accounts for 50% of all fuel used, and hedged oil supplies don't last forever, which means there's a shortfall, and that is very quickly passed on to you and me, the consumer. The holiday company Thomas Cook, for instance, alongside a whole host of airlines from Lufthansa to British Airways, have recently hiked their fuel surcharges. They say,
we have worked hard to keep the impact of the rising fuel costs on our holidaymakers to a minimum, but the fuel levy is an unavoidable result of the rising price of oil.
From region to region, the effect of oil price rises will undoubtedly vary. The Gulf region, for instance, will benefit from other oil-related business rising in value as a result, although airlines based there have always denied that they directly benefit from being based in an oil-rich part of the world.
So there's no global platform for fuel pricing, but certainly we don't get any special deal against any other airline.
But the simple fact that you're based here means that you can buy a lot of oil from here.
Well, at the end of the day, you know, the oil company has their mandate, their profitability targets, and they treat us as they would any other customer.
In the West, in particular, it looks like one type of traveller will have to go back to the drawing board again with their holiday plans.
I think it's families that are going to be hit the hardest. The increase of around $60 on a long-haul flight means that a family holiday, say from the UK to Florida, is going to be an extra $240. And there have already been increase in taxes, such as the air passenger duty. So that could double that sum again in terms of additional costs for families who are already struggling with increased food costs, increased fuel costs at home, and they're the ones that are being hit the hardest.
And if airlines follow their familiar path of cutting capacity and routes to save on increased costs, that ultimately means less choice for consumers too. The reality is there have been worse oil crises in the 1970s, for instance, and as recently as 2008, when oil prices hit a whopping $147 a barrel. So the optimists say, don't panic, you've never had it so good.
Consumers will have to get used to the idea that for probably the first decade of the 21st century, we all travelled for rather less than we should have done. The price of oil is certainly going to increase the cost of flying for the next decade, but still, relative to most people's incomes, flying around the world has really been a better deal.
And Libya is still producing at least 40% of its usual supply, while Saudi Arabia and the other major oil-producing nations have said they have oil, 4 million barrels at least a day, to make up for the Libyan shortfall anyway. But the doom-mongers aren't so sure that OPEC will cope if the crisis continues. They say right now we're more dependent than ever on oil.
Of course, the big game changer, the one that everyone fears, is that if turmoil spreads to Saudi Arabia.
If the instability spreads to Saudi Arabia, which is such a crucial producer, then all bets are off. We might see the price of oil maybe even go through the $200 a barrel mark, which would spell very bad news for the airlines and, of course, for us travellers.
Either way, the instability alone will encourage airlines to keep prices high and consumers to moderate their travel plans.
I think inevitably there is going to be a slowdown in overseas travel, and I think we may see a return to the trend of some years ago when one annual holiday was what families could afford. There's been some interesting trends in travel recently. Rail travel has become increasingly popular because of environmental concerns and also the rise of the staycation, and I think both these things will become increasingly attractive options to cash-strapped families.
One thing, there's been an awful lot of talk recently about alternative sources of fuel. So what's happened to them?
Algae instead of oil, test flights using biofuels, recent initiatives that have promised to lighten our dependency on conventional fuel. Now surely the economic case for these feels as strong as the environmental one.
It is an incentive, but we're talking about a very long-term process here. These fuels are not going to be developed overnight. It's going to take a lot of investment, a lot of ramping up, so it's very much a long-term business. The industry itself is probably looking at maybe 6% of their total fuel usage coming from biofuels by 2020, so that's still a long way off.
The optimists continue to point to the predicted growth in the global economy of 3% this year to counteract the oil price rises. The pessimists say that won't be enough. And ultimately, it looks like passengers in the rest of the world will be paying the price for the struggle for democratic reform in the Middle East. But then again, many travellers may feel it's worth it.
So, have you noticed the price of flights going up during the recent political unrest? Will you be staying at home if they continue to rise? We want to know what you think, so email us at the usual address, fasttracktravel@bbc.co.uk. Time now for the rest of the travel news from around the world.
A volcanic eruption has closed large parts of the Volcanoes National Park in Hawaii. Park rangers have warned tourists to keep their distance from Volcano Kilauea, as land near the site could collapse without warning. Safe areas of the park are still open. Chinese officials have restricted travel to Tibet ahead of the 3rd anniversary of anti-government protests. Travel agents have been ordered not to issue visas to foreign tourists. The Chinese government says the restrictions are due to safety concerns about overcrowding and severe cold. And a Kenyan man has built a plane in his backyard using only the internet and engineering books for instructions. Gabriel De Rito says it was his childhood dream to fly a plane. He spent thousands of dollars on the project, but Kenyan authorities say the craft is not airworthy. Well, stay with us because coming up after the break, Carmen's here, getting into the St Patrick's Day spirit early with her best of travel on the web. And we travel to Nepal to spend some time with some amazing animals.